Here's an unfortunate accident involving two of our planes. You're viewing remarkable World War II color footage shot and edited by Jack Lieb around the time of D-Day. It's footage unlike anything you've seen before. With his own 16mm Kodachrome camera, Lieb offers a close, personal viewpoint. His film carries the viewer from the D-Day build-up in England through Paris's liberation and on into Germany. Along the route, he captured everyday life in France, punctuated by brief appearances from figures like Ernest Hemingway. These frames were taken by automatic cameras fitted to fighter planes. When a pilot claimed a kill, he needed photographic proof to receive credit. Those cameras were linked to the guns, and if you watch closely, you can even spot a pilot bailing out in one sequence. You'll also notice many of the fighters still have auxiliary fuel tanks slung beneath their wings. When a bullet struck one of those tanks, the aircraft would erupt in flames, as you'll see here. Shots like that meant the pilot almost certainly did not return. Naturally, the big guns produced tremendous concussion, and it was hard to steady a handheld camera for long periods. One of the first tasks the Americans undertook was to construct an airstrip in the St. Mary-Glise area near the coast. They laid down a surface supported by metal mesh to keep the planes from sinking into soft ground. They used that strip for takeoffs with 500-pound bombs hung under each wing. The runway was so rough that bombs sometimes worked loose. Even when armed, they had to be removed and made safe before the aircraft could use the field. The fighters you see here are P-47s. One of them carries a bomb beneath each wing to strike targets well behind enemy lines. Notice two aircraft lifting off together, kicking up clouds of dust, yet managing to clear a very short strip. Look at the buckle beneath the wheel. Sometimes the mesh would snag and spring up, striking a propeller and causing a crash before the plane ever left the ground. One of the places that fascinated me was my first visit to London, to the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben. These images are over a quarter of a century old. What amused and occupied our men stationed across England was Westminster Abbey. Many Americans came to see the sights, and these are the scenes I wanted to capture on a Sunday afternoon. Another spot that caught my eye was Marble Arch. On that Sunday, Marble Arch was crowded with people. Keep in mind, London was being bombed nearly every night then. I photographed speakers addressing the crowds, each on a different topic, while police looked on. So long as no heated fights broke out, no one was harmed. The audience often shouted back at the speakers. These were the ordinary moments we used to pass the time while waiting for D-Day. Most children had been evacuated from English cities, though many remained. Despite the war, they found ways to amuse themselves. I was surprised to see youngsters drinking from communal cups at a fountain. I tried to take candid pictures so they wouldn't notice me, though occasionally they did. Here a child enjoys a cold drink on a fine Sunday afternoon. We found St. Paul's Cathedral had been struck several times, but not severely damaged. Another attraction was Buckingham Palace and its gates, guarded by British troops in full wartime kit rather than the bearskin hats. They marched their rounds, performing their duty. Note the barrage balloons in the background. London was dotted with them. People joked that without those balloons, with all the material being brought in, the islands might sink. Food was scarce in London then, and was being brought in and unloaded by any means available. A bright spring day in London is rare, and this one offered a chance to show what soldiers did while waiting for the invasion. On Fleet Street, we found an Irish policeman on duty and considerable damage in the neighborhood. Before long we were down on England's south coast, where we met other correspondents scheduled to cross the channel with us. You'll likely recognize some of the veteran reporters who covered the war. I was handed a shovel for self-defense, and it proved useful. Here you see Larry Lesueur of CBS. He was covering the war for CBS, with Werton Becker on the left, Jack Thompson of the Chicago Tribune, and Ernie Pyle. This is a close shot of Jack Thompson. Here is Larry O'Reilly of the Associated Press. That's Werton Becker. We exchange farewells, expecting to meet again in Paris. On the left are Clark Lee of INS and Bill Stoneman from the Daily News, along with several other correspondents being loaded onto a military truck bound for the South Coast. We passed through small British towns where life went on as usual, people shopping in market squares as if nothing extraordinary were happening. After a 150-mile ride, that's how we felt crammed into an army vehicle. We found Plymouth badly damaged. Many buildings lay in ruins, a scene repeated across the region. Near the docks, we saw American jeeps queued to board landing craft. Note the bars fixed to their bumpers, meant to cut wires the Germans sometimes strung across roads. We weren't free to wander. Every crossroads was guarded by both American and British soldiers, and if they wanted to inspect your bedroll, you had to show it. All this care was taken to keep the invasion plan secret as long as possible. The two men with me were Wes Carroll of the OWI and Pete Carroll, Wes Haynes rather, and we boarded LCI number 5. Pete Carroll came from Boston and worked as a photographer for the Associated Press. We tried to keep our minds occupied, knowing it would be only a short time before we were underway. We tried K-rations for the first time. They weren't bad when you were hungry, and we also had a chance to take in the lovely countryside nearby. And these are the kinds of images I wanted to bring home for my family and friends. Pete Carroll was shooting some of his own footage, and before long we were down at the docks where units of the 101st Airborne Division were lugging everything by hand, boarding landing craft so heavily loaded they had to be shoved off the quay by trucks, as you can see, and these men were then transferred to larger vessels and readied for the invasion, and here you can see squads carrying grenades and bazookas. They hadn't had the chance to stow this gear on jeeps because the vehicles weren't fully available at that moment. We rode with a flotilla of LCIs, shown here with the invasion group commander in the center and the ship's captain to the right. The skipper of our boat, Lieutenant Patton, commanded LCI number 5, and we learned he had taken part in several Mediterranean landings, so we felt fairly sure he knew his business, though we remained aboard that ship for nearly 5 days. This is the squadron commander. I remember Lieutenant Patton's name clearly because we were with him so long. Wes Haynes was getting ready for the dash into Paris. I think he was a bit premature. And these are men of the 101st Airborne aboard our landing craft, clowning around, and I needn't tell you who this fellow is impersonating. He had once played football for Notre Dame, and I was later told he was killed in action. Naturally, every ship had a mascot, and ours was no exception. But the boys looked after their mascot by fashioning a little life preserver just like the ones they wore themselves. Then one afternoon, Lieutenant Patton briefed the crew and announced we would sail that day, and they cheered because this was the job they'd been waiting for. They wanted to finish it and go home. And here we see LCI number 4 with its commander moving out into the channel. And it was an incredible sight. Ships as far as the eye could see, vessels of every kind. They told me there were well over 1,000 ships, yet even then we thought it might be just another exercise. As we steamed on, we expected to be turned back and try again another day. But when we pushed through the night, we realized it was the real operation. At one point, we had a scare. Word went around that a submarine was in the area, and one of the DE boats dropped depth charges into the channel, and they detonated, but we never observed any actual attack. Here are scenes taken close to the shore, where the ships made a right-angle turn and headed for the landing zone. That is a DE boat out in the distance, and of course we were alert for any kind of assault, even air raids. Fortunately, our air force performed well, and to my knowledge, there was no German attack except after we had landed, when 2 planes tried to strafe the beach, and I happened to be nearby. These are shots I made with my camera reduced to 16mm. This particular sequence of men going ashore was filmed by an automatic camera mounted on a British landing craft, and they were the first to hit the beach. The reason for the automatic camera was to have a record in case the landing failed. At least they might recover the film and learn what happened, and how to avoid the same mistakes if another attempt were necessary. But here are scenes of landing on Utah Beach, and this is how we went ashore. Again, this is at the British sector, but notice the men did not rush forward after being aboard landing craft for 5 straight days. They stepped off slowly and cautiously, wary of bombs and mines sown in the area. You can see their rifles wrapped in cellophane, and this was the way we had to come ashore, and I needn't tell you that many of the boys did not make it. Here are Pete Carroll and Wes Haynes carrying our gear, and the ship is aground on the beach. The stretch of beach we occupied was under enemy fire, and in an earlier shot you can see a bomb land not far from where we stood. There it is again. Bulldozers were trying to clear roads so our jeeps and tanks could move forward, and although it was June, the weather was quite cold, as it often is in that part of Normandy. Naturally, the men dug their foxholes a bit deeper, and we were fortunate to find a concrete wall that offered some protection. But even then, we were evacuating wounded back to the beach so they could be shipped to England. When the tide went out, the ships could not come in close, and those that had gone aground had to wait to be refloated if they weren't hit. We spent the first night on the beach living in a foxhole, and before long we showed some of the first prisoners taken in the area late that day who had been captured near the shore and were sent back to England because there was no room to hold them there. This is our first command post where General Collins on the left is speaking with some of his officers, and we were able to get some of the first hot food there, and I didn't realize how hungry I was until I saw these pictures. There's Larry Lesueur again and Bob Landry on the right. Bob Landry was covering the war for Time and Life, and although it kept me busy for 8 straight days, I ran out of film and decided to return to France later to get more and probably to get a bath. I hadn't taken my clothes off during that whole time, and my landing in England occurred near Bournemouth. It almost resembles the cliffs of Dover that everyone knows, but it was a beautiful sight to see the English coast and know I might get some rest. I didn't realize then that the buzz bombs would begin to come over, and here we see some of them flying along the English shoreline. Those buzz bombs were a terror weapon. No one knew where they would fall, but the British were quick to set up machine guns and anti-aircraft fire to try to knock them down, and they managed to shoot down quite a few. They even scrambled planes to intercept them, and of course sometimes the bombs got through, and where they fell they caused heavy damage. There's one actually coming down, and it landed in the London area, and wherever they struck, they did considerable harm. My second channel crossing was aboard an LST, this time with units of the 3rd Armored Division that were desperately needed because they were bringing over more tanks and vehicles to push us toward Cherbourg, since we badly needed a port. The LST was crewed by the British. That's the skipper in the long line of vessels, each one piled high with desperately needed gear, and here you can get a sense of the shoreline. These ships are waiting for the tide to fall so they can unload without having to wade through deep water. On D-Day, they had to cross the deep water, but at this moment they were holding back until the ramps could be rebuilt after a fierce storm so they could land without damage. You can see the trouble they ran into on D-Day. When a landing craft struck the sandbars, the men began wading ashore only to find deeper water ahead, and those whose life preservers rode too low around their waists capsized, with many drowning. These, however, are units of the 3rd Army moving in, crossing the deep patch just ahead of them, and pushing on toward Cherbourg itself. It was an astonishing sight. Ships stretched to the horizon, delivering supplies. We badly needed Cherbourg, thinking we could use it as a port, but as you can see, Cherbourg had been heavily wrecked by the Germans themselves. They blew up the docks we hoped to use, and if memory serves, it took nearly 2 months before a ship could enter. They planted mines and demolished the famous Cherbourg Keys, where transatlantic liners once berthed. Not only were the docks ruined, but the inland bridges spanning the rivers and canals feeding the Cherbourg area were destroyed as well. Here is one of those bridges, wrecked by the Germans. Before long, the French returned to the city and greeted us warmly. And we soon found prisoners, I believe some 16 to 18,000. Men were rounded up from the Cherbourg region, still carrying their personal effects as they marched toward the beaches to be shipped to England, and some later to the United States for POW camps. Even then, those who would speak to us predicted we'd be driven back into the Channel within a week. At every headquarters, we found portraits of our Hitler, which our men used as pin boards. The Americans, of course, found ways to amuse themselves. Here is the first formal ceremony held in France. General Collins, on the right, presented a tricolor made from parachute silk to the mayor of Cherbourg, who is holding the microphone. Our troops of the 7th Corps were issued clean uniforms for the occasion, and soon residents returning to Cherbourg after the fighting came to visit and speak with us. Here we see Ernie Pyle again in the center talking with the Signal Corps Colonel. That's Bert Branch shooting for AP, with Cecil Carnes and John McLindsey nearby. My memory has faded a bit over the decades. The troops then swung in the opposite direction to attack along the Saint-Lô line, and we passed through the town of Valognes, which had been utterly destroyed. I've been back several times since the war, and it's been beautifully rebuilt, but where the Germans tried to hold ground, we had to dislodge them, and in doing so the town was ruined. Later, I had a chance to see works constructed by slave labor, and all along the beaches, especially in Normandy and other sectors, they erected those triangular obstacles. Many of those obstacles were wired with mines so that if a boat struck them, they would detonate, and after walking among them, I was warned to be very careful not to step where the sand was soft. This is a church in Barfla, a charming little town the Germans evacuated because the local commander liked it so much he preferred to withdraw rather than see it destroyed. It was a small fishing village, and I was fortunate to return several times because the hotel remained intact and served excellent French cuisine. A little farther down the coast, we found fortifications built by slave labor, even metal fences meant to keep us from landing, and massive concrete works many feet thick. The correspondents inspected them closely. In some places, the Germans had blown up their own defenses, so we couldn't use them if they tried to retake the ground. They even wrecked their own weapons, but we could see the walls and fortifications were extremely thick and solid. The Navy took over the area and established an observation post right out on the point. This was near a town called Granville, and you can see the lighthouse at the tip that more or less marks the boundary between Normandy and Brittany. That observation post was originally used by the Germans, and now it's been taken over and is being used by our naval officers as a lookout. Before long, we brought up some of our heavy guns, set them in a field and opened fire on German positions, yet the French were still harvesting their crops as if nothing were happening. That sight surprised me, and I couldn't resist taking a picture. Naturally, those big guns produced tremendous concussion, and it was hard to hold a handheld camera steady for long. One of the first tasks the Americans undertook was to construct an airstrip in the St. Mary-Glise area near the coast, laying down a surface supported by metal mesh so the planes wouldn't sink into the ground. They also used it for takeoffs with 500-pound bombs slung under each wing, but the runway was so rough that the bombs often worked loose, and even when armed, had to be removed and made safe before the planes could use the field. The fighters you see here are P-47s, and one of them carries a bomb beneath each wing to strike targets well behind enemy lines. Notice these two aircraft lifting off together, kicking up a cloud of dust, yet managing to clear a very short strip. Look at the buckle beneath the wheel. Sometimes the mesh would snag and spring up, striking a propeller and causing a crash before the plane ever left the ground. Here's an unfortunate accident involving two of our planes. These frames were taken by automatic cameras fitted to the fighters because a pilot claiming a kill needed photographic proof to receive credit. Those cameras were linked to the guns, and if you watch closely, you can even see a pilot bailing out in one shot. You'll also see many of these planes still carrying auxiliary fuel tanks under the wings. When a bullet struck one of those tanks, the aircraft would erupt in flames, as you'll observe here. Shots like that meant the pilot almost certainly did not return. One of the highlights of our journey through France was Mont Saint-Michel. Mont Saint-Michel sits on a channel that separates Normandy from Brittany. There we met fellow correspondents. This is Bob Capper of Time magazine, and I know someone here remembers Bob Capper. He was later killed while covering the fighting in Indochina. At Mont Saint-Michel, we found the Poulard Hotel run by Madame Poulard, famed for the delicious omelets she served. That's Madame Poulard with her well-known hotel in the background. Many correspondents gathered there to cover the war from a point closer to the front than our main bases, and you can see the channel that divides Normandy from Brittany. It's a lovely little island, and the building on the summit is a monastery that remained intact. It was not destroyed. Here are some of our GIS looking over the monastery grounds, guided by a local woman. Soon we ran into other correspondents we knew. Here you see Charles Collingwood on the right with Helen Kirkpatrick of Chicago Daily News, Joe Liebling of The New Yorker, the bald gentleman, and Wardens Becker at the far left. Liebling wrote many pieces for The New Yorker and passed away not many years ago. This is Charles Collingwood and Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News. This is Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was reporting for Collier's magazine, and we met him at Mont Saint-Michel. Here he is talking with Bill Walton, who, incidentally, later became a close friend of President Kennedy. These are just little moments when we could steal a bit of rest. There's Helen Kirkpatrick, and the man in the center of this photo is Bill Stringer. He was killed trying to get into Paris. Correspondents often try to be the first into the city, and he was struck by an 88 shell. But this is simply a pause for relaxation. We had a few such moments, and naturally these are the kinds of pictures I wanted to bring home to family and friends. The tiny island was very charming and ancient, though it had been fortified in several ways. We found that the beaches nearby, especially at low tide, lay high and dry, and the Germans had driven stakes into the sand to keep our planes from landing. We came across a little family of 3 brothers. Even the tall blonde, one turned out to be a boy. I learned later, since their grandmother was caring for them. I was told their parents were killed at the Battle of St. Lo. One late afternoon, I walked out behind the island because as the sun went down, I could get some striking shots of the isle from the seaward side. The tides here are extreme and leave the island high and dry, but the water comes in very fast and there's always the danger of quicksand, so I didn't linger in one spot. The retreating tide left an unusual pattern in the sand. We didn't remain at Mont Saint-Michel long, and soon pushed further into France. I spent some time in Brittany and found the men had discovered a lake there, which you'll see in a moment. The countryside was lovely. It was summer, and the crops were still standing, and our boys, after weeks of washing in helmets, decided to use that beautiful lake for a bath. They were allowed to do so because fighting was focused at St. Malo, where, as you may recall, the Germans held out for many months nearly to the war's end. It was the American sense of humor that helped keep spirits up. Here are some of the correspondents we often traveled with. We found a small river that served nicely for a wash. France is full of such little streams, and whenever we had a spare moment, the correspondents would take advantage. That's Ralph Morse up front, with Huey Broderick and Joe Priestley, and here we see Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson was one of the many actors who came to Normandy to entertain the troops. They staged a show in a barn not far from the fighting, and I later learned the intermission had to be called when shells came too close. Of course, you only had to point a camera at Robinson, and he performed. Before long, we found ourselves in Rambouillet. Rambouillet, about 52 kilometers from Paris, served as headquarters for the correspondents. We see Ernie Pyle again on the left, George Stevens, the Hollywood director, myself, and Pete Carroll. Shortly after these photos were taken, Ernie Pyle decided to return to the States and then went on to the Pacific, where he was killed. George Stevens was a well-known director. You'll recall his name, and he passed away only a few years ago. Nearly every correspondent turned out to try to get into the city that General Eisenhower had authorized the 2nd French Armored Division to take, Paris, because the priority was to defeat the enemy, and taking the city directly would have delayed operations. They wanted to bypass Paris to allow the French the honor. General Leclerc commanded the 2nd Armored Division and refused to let correspondents ride with his force into the city because he didn't want any pictures taken until he had secured it. We were thrilled to see Paris. It's a city of great beauty, and we were astonished by the crowds that turned out. These are some shots from the first day of liberation. I didn't get nearly enough because there was so much to do, and soon General de Gaulle entered the city and marched down the Champs-Élysées, taking the salute and receiving flowers from a French girl. Remember, de Gaulle was not widely known then, and few could hear the radio reports of his work in England before the crossing, but he quickly became popular. It seemed everyone in Paris came out to see him as he marched the avenue. It was an unforgettable sight. Later, our own troops paraded down the Champs-Élysées, which made us all proud. As de Gaulle paraded, sporadic firing broke out from forces left behind, thought to be FFI elements or fascists still in the city trying to frighten people. And if you stuck your head out a window, you risked getting shot. This continued for hours. I was right in the middle of it and took shots of people lying flat on the ground. They'd crawl under our car. We couldn't move while they tried to stop the shooting by waving white flags, but went on and on. Though it was only small arms fire, de Gaulle held his ground. Mother wasn't taking chances, but this is how the streets of Paris looked on Liberation Day. They did capture some of those responsible for the shooting. At least that's what we were told. It seemed like a war of nerves. These are late-day shots of American troops marching through the streets toward the front. Wherever we stopped, the French were there, trading champagne for cigarettes, talking to us, and asking what was happening. We were able to see the city. It wasn't badly ruined. There was some small arms damage. The lion lost his tail. But by and large, the bridges were intact, and here is the Opera House. Since it was my first visit to Paris, I enjoyed seeing the city's beauty. Soon Parisians were parading again along the Champs-Élysées with their newfound freedom. We discovered the Eiffel Tower, rumored destroyed and used for arms, was still standing, and I managed to get permission to go up and see the view. There was much to do, and despite Paris's beauty, conditions were harsh. The railways were nearly wrecked. There was no way to bring in food. On the road, we saw long lines of trucks waiting to enter the city, loaded with supplies to support a population in dire need of food and coal, since it was getting cold late in the year, and supplies couldn't reach them. These are scenes from the Eiffel Tower showing the Seine and the buildings nearby. We saw troops parading through the streets, but we had to move on, and soon I left Paris for the countryside and crossed into Belgium, where I reached Brussels. These are shots of the Autodrome racetrack, which reopened shortly after liberation, much to everyone's surprise, though they closed it again after a few days. One thing that surprised many was how well-dressed French women were. They had a knack for making the most of what they had and looking attractive, which apparently annoyed some Allied visitors who couldn't understand it. They even reopened art galleries along the boulevards, and we weren't sure if they were allowed to do so before we arrived, but they were certainly back in business soon after. We found a painter at work in the old quarter. Shortly after leaving Paris, I went to the Ardennes. I took countryside shots because the weather was turning cold and the trees were changing color. This is the town of Houvelize, which was completely destroyed in the breakthrough and the attack on Bastogne. I had been in Bastogne just days before the breakthrough and was lucky to get out before the assault. I suspected it was a place the enemy could hide troops, and indeed they did. There's General Collins again talking with General Maurice Rose, who commanded the 3rd Armored Division. That's General Rose on the left. General Rose was later killed in Cologne. It was a regrettable incident. They believed the area secure, yet enemy troops were present and he was shot. These are elements of the 3rd Armored Division engaged with the foe, and we managed to film them being entertained by local German children. Across France, we received a warm welcome, but once we reached Germany, that welcome vanished. Homes in the German towns flew white flags as a sign of surrender, and the children you see were actually on their way to school. Kids everywhere were covering their ears because our guns were firing nearby, and they were simply trying to avoid the noise. We came upon the Siegfried Line, the so-called Dragon's Teeth, reportedly built by slave labor, and they proved no real barrier to our tanks. Our bulldozers pushed earth over them and rode right across. These defenses ran from one end of Germany to the other, as if they hoped to keep us out, but of course they failed. The fighting moved quickly in parts of Germany, and before long, I found myself in Aachen. Aachen was under fire when these pictures were taken, which is why the streets are empty. Mortar shells passed over our heads constantly, and the enemy still held the city center while we filmed, and we wondered how long the battle would last. We found troops just behind that wreckage in the distance and learned that reserves were only a block or two behind the front, waiting to be committed. I was later told that the captain you saw a moment ago, someone in the audience knew him, was killed in the action that followed. After Aachen, I was offered a flight home, which I welcomed, and here we see some of the cemeteries established above the Normandy beaches. And scenes of Berlin showing the vast destruction the city suffered. The bombing was severe and little of Berlin remained standing. It demonstrates that wars accomplish little beyond wrecking property and costing lives, and one hopes that someday we'll learn to avoid them. Perhaps we have made war so lethal that avoiding it is the only way to survive. Soon I photographed events when General Eisenhower returned to the States and was greeted in Kansas City. Those shots were taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. I also visited an exhibit of German weapons captured after the invasion. Here is the V-2 rocket that followed the V-1s. The V-1s were terror weapons, and the V-2s were no less frightening. It was the first time rockets were used, and they could be launched great distances. The V-1 I heard many pass overhead, sounded like motorcycle engines, and when the motor stopped, the bomb would fall. The Germans even had jet fighters in the air before the war ended. Here is one they used, and its record showed many Allied planes shot down. If you note, it had downed 42 Russians before it was captured. In the exhibit, we also saw a Japanese kamikaze device on display, and one of our pilots is trying it on for size. The idea of a one-way trip was not popular, since these weapons were meant to destroy both the target and the pilot. I was told this plane was designed by the enemy to reach New York and return across the ocean, and they aptly nicknamed it Alice Kaput. Here are images I call a glimpse of what a future war might look like. This is the atomic blast in New Mexico. When I show these pictures, I like to think they remind people of what World War II was like and warn that a third world war would be far worse. I often repeat a scientist's grim observation: the atomic bomb is here to stay. The question is, are we? And with that, we come to the end of our film. Thank you very much. Subscribe to History Safe to see more original, restored historical footage in stunning color.